January 1943, North Africa. The airfield dust swirls as P-40 Warhawks are being prepared for combat. The pilots walking toward their aircraft are Black American fighter pilots, the 99th Pursuit Squadron. They are about to fly their first combat mission. They are about to prove something that America's military establishment has spent decades denying. They are about to prove that Black Americans can fly fighter aircraft in combat. They are about to prove that segregation in the military is not justified by any legitimate military consideration. They are about to prove that courage and competence transcend race. But before they can prove anything, they will have to overcome obstacles that have nothing to do with enemy aircraft. They will have to overcome racism embedded in military structures. They will have to overcome systemic discrimination that tried to prevent them from flying at all. They will have to overcome the belief held by military leadership that Black Americans were not capable of flying combat aircraft. This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen. This is the story of the 332nd Fighter Group and their legendary Red Tails. This is the story of how men facing systemic racism and discrimination created a doctrinal innovation that changed military aviation forever. This is the story of how courage in the face of adversity can transform organizational culture and military strategy. The story begins years before 1943. The story begins with racism embedded in American military policy. For decades, the military had officially refused to allow Black Americans to serve as combat pilots. The military had official policies stating that Black Americans were not suitable for flying aircraft. The military had created elaborate justifications for discrimination based on pseudo-scientific racism. But pressure was building. Civil rights advocates were questioning these discriminatory policies. Eleanor Roosevelt was pushing the military to reconsider. Politicians were recognizing that keeping talented Americans out of combat roles because of race was morally wrong and strategically foolish. The military was facing a choice: maintain segregationist policies or allow Black Americans to serve as pilots. In 1941, the military made a decision. They would allow Black Americans to train as pilots, but the military was going to make sure this program failed. The military was going to locate the program in the segregated South. The military was going to provide inadequate facilities. The military was going to provide inferior equipment. The military was going to create obstacles at every step. The military was betting that the program would fail so badly that the military could point to failure as justification for continued segregation. Subscribe right now, because this story about organizational courage in the face of systemic discrimination deserves to reach millions of people who need to understand how to overcome institutional barriers. The Tuskegee program was established at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Tuskegee was a historically Black college. Tuskegee was in the segregated South. Tuskegee was isolated from mainstream military facilities. Tuskegee was chosen specifically to make the program difficult and likely to fail. The training was intentionally brutal. The instructors were deliberately tough. The washout rates were deliberately high. The military was not trying to create a successful program. The military was trying to create evidence of failure that could justify continued segregation. But something unexpected happened. The pilots who made it through Tuskegee training were exceptional. The pilots who completed the program despite intentional obstacles were not just competent. They were dedicated. They were determined. They understood that they represented not just themselves but their entire race. They understood that their failure would be interpreted as proof that Black Americans couldn't fly. They understood the stakes in a way that white pilots didn't have to understand them. The first 5 graduates received their wings in March 1942. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was among them. Davis would eventually become the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. Davis would become a legendary figure in military aviation. But Davis started as a young pilot who had proven that Black Americans could earn their wings and fly combat aircraft. These early pilots faced public doubts. They faced hostile press coverage. They faced military leadership that wanted them to fail. But these pilots were undeterred. These pilots understood that they were breaking barriers. These pilots understood that their performance would influence military policy. These pilots were willing to bear that burden. The 99th Pursuit Squadron entered combat in North Africa in June 1943. Their first combat mission resulted in their first kill. Lieutenant Charles Hall shot down an enemy aircraft on June 9, 1943. The barrier was broken. Black American pilots had shot down enemy aircraft in combat. The military could no longer claim that black pilots couldn't fly combat aircraft. But the real obstacle was not the enemy aircraft. The real obstacle was the aircraft that the 99th were flying. The 99th were flying P-40 Warhawks. The P-40 was an obsolete aircraft by 1943. The P-40 was a solid airplane but was outclassed by modern German fighters. The 99th were flying aircraft that were inferior to the aircraft flown by German pilots. This was deliberate. The military was still trying to sabotage the program. The military was providing the 99th with outdated equipment. The military was setting them up to fail. If the 99th could not achieve high kill counts against enemy aircraft, the military could claim that black pilots were incompetent. But the 99th were flying against pilots who had experience. The 99th were flying against German pilots who had been flying since 1939. The 99th were flying against aircraft that had superior performance, and the 99th were achieving kills. The 99th were proving that they could fly combat missions successfully, despite being provided with inferior equipment. Like this video, because this story about overcoming systematic obstacles deserves massive reach and should influence how every organization thinks about creating opportunities for talented people who face discrimination. By 1944, the 332nd Fighter Group had been formed. The 332nd included the 99th plus additional squadrons. The 382nd was being equipped with newer aircraft. The 382nd was transitioning from P-40s to P-47s and eventually to P-51 Mustangs. The 382nd was being given better equipment. The 382nd was beginning to receive better treatment. But something crucial was happening. The pilots of the 382nd were developing a revolutionary new doctrine. The standard doctrine for fighter escort was to fly loose formations and aggressively pursue enemy fighters. The standard doctrine was to leave the bombers undefended while fighters engaged enemy aircraft. The standard doctrine was based on the idea that the best defense was an aggressive offense. The 332nd rejected this doctrine. The 332nd adopted a different approach. The 332nd decided to stay close to the bombers. The 332nd decided to fly tight formations around the bombers. The 332nd decided that the primary mission was protecting the bombers, not achieving kills. The 332nd decided that they would accept fewer individual kills if it meant protecting more bombers. This was revolutionary. This was contrary to standard Air Force doctrine. This was what bomber crews desperately needed, but had never received. Bomber crews had been suffering enormous casualties. Bomber crews had been losing aircraft to enemy fighters. Bomber crews had been begging for fighter escort that would actually protect them instead of leaving them to fight alone while fighters chased enemy aircraft. The 332nd provided that protection. The 332nd flew close escort missions. The 332nd stayed with the bombers. The 332nd protected bomber formations. The 332nd earned the gratitude of bomber crews. The 332nd became known as the Red Tail Angels. The 332nd became legendary. The P-51 Mustangs of the 332nd were painted with red tails. The red paint was distinctive. The red paint made the 332nd instantly identifiable. The red paint became symbolic of the best fighter escort in the European theater. The red tails represented a promise to bomber crews. The promise that protection would be there. The promise that the red tails would keep them safe. Tell me in the comments if you understand what this doctrinal innovation meant. Tell me if you recognize that changing the way a military unit approached its mission created enormous advantages. The impact was immediate and measurable. Bombers escorted by the 332nd suffered dramatically lower losses compared to bombers escorted by other fighter groups. The 332nd's close escort doctrine was saving bomber crews. The 332nd's protection was allowing bombers to complete their missions. The 332nd's innovation was changing air warfare. The official record states that the 382nd had an unprecedented bomber escort record. The exact number of bombers lost to enemy fighters, while under 332nd escort, is debated by historians. Some say 0 bombers were lost. Some say the number is close to 0. But all historians agree that the 332nd had the lowest loss rate of any fighter group in the 15th Air Force. The 382nd had the best bomber escort record in the entire theater. This was not an accident. This was not luck. This was the result of a deliberate doctrinal innovation. This was the result of pilots who understood what their mission was and executed it perfectly. This was the result of leadership that was willing to reject standard doctrine and implement something better. The implications went far beyond bomber escort missions. The 332nd's close escort doctrine was eventually adopted as standard USAF doctrine. The 332nd proved that staying with bombers was the right approach. The 332nd proved that accepting fewer individual kills in exchange for more bombers protected was the right trade-off. The 332nd changed how the entire Air Force approached fighter escort. But the implications went even further. The 332nd's success created irrefutable evidence that segregation was unjustified. The 332nd's success proved that Black American pilots could fly combat aircraft. The 332nd's success proved that Black American pilots could innovate militarily. The 332nd's success proved that race had nothing to do with military capability. The military could no longer claim that Black Americans were not capable of flying combat aircraft. The military could no longer justify segregationist policies based on pseudo-scientific racism. The military had to confront the fact that segregation was a moral wrong and a military inefficiency. Subscribe, because understanding how organizations overcome systemic barriers through excellence is essential for every leader seeking to build inclusive organizations. Now let me tell you about Benjamin O. Davis Jr., because understanding Davis's role helps explain how leadership shaped the 332nd's success. Davis became commander of the 332nd. Davis was a graduate of West Point. Davis was a pilot who had been trained at Tuskegee. Davis understood both the military hierarchy and the struggles that Black pilots faced. Davis understood the mission of the 332nd. Davis understood what needed to be done. Davis made decisions that shaped the 332nd's culture. Davis decided that discipline would be paramount. Davis decided that the 392nd would be the most disciplined fighter group in the theater. Davis decided that the 392nd would execute their missions flawlessly. Davis decided that the 332nd would leave no room for criticism from racist military officers who were looking for any excuse to claim that Black pilots were incompetent. Davis's leadership style was demanding. Davis expected perfection. Davis pushed his pilots to perform at the highest levels. Davis accepted nothing less than excellence. Davis understood that his pilots were bearing the weight of representing their entire race. Davis understood that excellence was not optional. Davis understood that mediocrity would be interpreted as proof of inferiority. This leadership created a culture of excellence. This leadership created a unit that was professional, disciplined, and effective. This leadership created a fighter group that outperformed other fighter groups. This leadership created the conditions that allowed the doctrinal innovation of close escort to be implemented perfectly. Davis also made another crucial decision. Davis decided that the 332nd would remain united. When the military tried to rotate pilots out of the 332nd into other units, Davis fought to keep his pilots. Davis understood that the 332nd's strength came from cohesion. Davis understood that replacing experienced pilots with new pilots would reduce effectiveness. Davis fought to maintain unit cohesion. Davis won those fights. This is a crucial organizational lesson. Cohesion matters. Unit cohesion creates organizational effectiveness. Leadership that protects unit cohesion creates stronger organizations. Davis understood this principle. Davis implemented it. Davis created a cohesive unit that was far more effective than units with higher turnover and less cohesion. Like this video, because understanding the importance of organizational cohesion is essential for every leader seeking to build effective organizations. The 332nd continued flying combat missions throughout 1944 and into 1945. The 332nd accumulated an impressive combat record. The 332nd shot down enemy aircraft. The 302nd flew bomber escort missions. The 332nd eventually flew missions against the new German jet fighters, the Me-262s. The 332nd even shot down jet fighters. The 332nd earned the Distinguished Unit Citation for a March 24, 1945 Berlin mission. But more importantly, the 332nd was changing military culture. The 332nd was proving that integration worked. The 392nd was proving that black pilots were as capable as white pilots. The 392nd was proving that segregation was counterproductive. The 392nd was proving that military excellence transcends race. The impact on military policy came after the war. President Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948. This order desegregated the military. This order integrated all military services. This order was influenced directly by the Tuskegee Airmen and the 332nd Fighter Group. The military had to acknowledge that segregation was inefficient and unjust. The military had to acknowledge that black Americans deserved equal opportunity. The 332nd's bomber escort doctrine also influenced post-war military strategy. The close escort tactics that the 392nd pioneered were adopted as standard procedure. These tactics influenced how the Air Force approached fighter escort in the jet age. These tactics continue to influence military aviation strategy today. Comment below with your thoughts on how organizations overcome systematic discrimination. Tell me if you recognize the power of excellence as a tool for breaking down barriers. Share your stories about how great performance can change organizational culture. Now let me explain what made the 332nd's doctrinal innovation so powerful, because understanding the mechanics of the innovation helps explain why it was revolutionary. The standard Air Force fighter escort doctrine called for fighters to fly ahead of and above the bomber formations. The fighters would patrol the skies looking for enemy aircraft. When enemy fighters appeared, the fighters would engage them aggressively. The fighters would try to achieve kills. The fighters would leave the bombers to defend themselves while the fighters pursued enemy aircraft. This approach had several problems. First, it left bombers vulnerable. When fighters left the bomber formation to pursue enemy fighters, bombers were undefended. Bombers were hit by enemy fighters while their escort was elsewhere. Second, it was inefficient. Fighters would sometimes miss opportunities to help bombers because they were focused on pursuing individual kills. Third, it was demoralizing. Bomber crews knew they were vulnerable. Bomber crews were afraid. The 392nd's approach was different. The 392nd decided that the primary mission was protecting bombers. The 392nd decided that individual kills were secondary. The 392nd decided to fly tight formations around bombers. The 392nd decided to stay with bombers throughout the entire mission. The 332nd decided that bombers would never be undefended. This approach had several advantages. First, it provided continuous protection. Bombers were never undefended. The 332nd was always there. Second, it was efficient. The 332nd was using their aircraft to maximize bomber protection rather than chasing individual kills. Third, it was reassuring. Bomber crews knew they were protected. Bomber crews could focus on their bombing mission instead of worrying about fighter attacks. The result was measurable. Bombers under 392nd escort suffered lower losses. The 332nd's tight escort formations were preventing bomber losses. The 332nd's doctrine was working. The 332nd's innovation was saving lives. This is an organizational lesson that applies far beyond military aviation. When organizations focus on their primary mission instead of secondary objectives, when organizations align all activities toward the central purpose, when organizations prioritize group outcomes over individual achievement, organizations become more effective. The 332nd understood their primary mission: protect bombers, not achieve kills, not win individual dogfights. Protect bombers. When organizations understand their primary mission that clearly, when organizations align all activities toward that mission, organizations become extraordinarily effective. Like this video because understanding primary mission focus is essential for every organization seeking to improve effectiveness. Now let me tell you what happened to the 332nd after the war. Because the post-war period tells you something important about institutional change. The 332nd was deactivated after the war. The pilots returned to a segregated America. The pilots returned to a military that was still segregated. The pilots had proven that integration worked. The pilots had demonstrated that Black Americans were as capable as white Americans. But the military was not ready to change policy immediately. It took President Truman's executive order in 1948 to formally desegregate the military. It took 3 more years before full integration occurred. It took additional time before integration became the norm. The 332nd had provided the evidence that made desegregation inevitable. But changing institutional policy still took time. This teaches an important lesson about organizational change. Excellence alone doesn't force institutional change immediately. Evidence alone doesn't change entrenched policies immediately. Sometimes it takes external pressure. Sometimes it takes political action. Sometimes it takes time for institutions to acknowledge and accept evidence that contradicts their existing policies. But the evidence eventually matters. The 332nd success eventually forced the military to acknowledge that segregation was wrong. The 332nd's performance eventually made desegregation inevitable. The 332nd's doctrinal innovation eventually became standard practice. This is an important principle. If you are trying to change institutional policies, if you are trying to overcome systemic discrimination, if you are trying to force organizational change, excellence is your most powerful tool. Excellence creates irrefutable evidence. Excellence makes denial impossible. Excellence forces institutions to acknowledge reality. The 392nd understood this principle. The 392nd used excellence as a tool for change. The 392nd understood that their performance was not just about winning battles. Their performance was about proving that segregation was unjustified. Their performance was about forcing military leadership to acknowledge that racism was counterproductive. Their performance was about changing military policy. Subscribe and share this story, because every person facing institutional discrimination needs to understand the power of excellence as a tool for change. Tell me in the comments, have you used excellence as a tool for changing institutional policies? Have you experienced situations where outstanding performance forced institutions to acknowledge injustice? Have you seen evidence eventually overcome institutional resistance? This is the story of the Tuskegee Airmen and the 392nd Fighter Group. This is the story of how men facing systemic discrimination and inadequate equipment created doctrinal innovations that changed military aviation. This is the story of how leadership like Benjamin O. Davis Jr. shaped organizational culture to emphasize excellence. This is the story of how the Red Tails became legendary. The 332nd's bomber escort record was unprecedented. The 332nd's close escort doctrine was revolutionary. The 302nd's impact on military desegregation was profound. The 302nd's legacy continues to influence military aviation and military policy today. But perhaps most importantly, the 332nd demonstrates a fundamental principle about overcoming systemic barriers. The principle is simple. Excellence is irrefutable. Mediocrity can be explained away. Excellence cannot be denied. When individuals facing systemic barriers achieve excellence, they force institutions to acknowledge that the barriers are unjust. The 332nd chose to respond to discrimination with excellence. The 332nd chose to respond to inferior equipment with superior tactics. The 332nd chose to respond to systematic obstacles with professional discipline. The 332nd chose to become the best fighter group in the entire theater. That choice changed military policy. That choice influenced military desegregation. That choice created a legacy that continues today. That choice teaches every person facing institutional discrimination that excellence is the most powerful response. That choice reminds every organization that merit matters more than race. That choice demonstrates that military effectiveness cannot be separated from justice. Like this video because this story of overcoming systemic barriers through excellence deserves massive reach and should influence how every organization thinks about fairness and merit. This is the complete story of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Red Tails. The story of the 332nd Fighter Group. The story of how men facing discrimination created innovations that changed military aviation forever. Remember this story. Learn from it. Make sure your organization values merit over race. Make sure your organization creates opportunities for talented people regardless of background. Make sure your organization rewards excellence. Make sure your organization punishes discrimination. Thank you for learning this story. Thank you for understanding why the Tuskegee Airmen matter. Thank you for recognizing that military excellence transcends race. Now go share this story everywhere. EOF. Let me take you deeper into the obstacles that the Tuskegee program faced, because understanding these obstacles explains why the achievement was so remarkable. The Tuskegee Airmen faced not just enemy aircraft, but systemic obstacles within their own military. The military was organized around segregation. Military facilities were segregated. Military leadership was segregated. Military pilots were segregated. The Tuskegee program was an exception to segregation policy, and many military leaders were determined to prove that the exception was a failure. The first obstacle was training. The training at Tuskegee was deliberately designed to be more difficult than training at other facilities. Black pilots were held to higher standards. Black pilots had higher washout rates. Black pilots faced instructors who were skeptical of their abilities. Black pilots had to prove themselves repeatedly. But this obstacle had an unexpected effect. The pilots who completed Tuskegee training were exceptionally well trained. The pilots who survived the rigorous training were exceptionally determined. The pilots who persisted through discrimination were exceptionally motivated. The pilots who completed the program were not just competent, they were superior. The second obstacle was equipment. The 99th were equipped with P-40 Warhawks. The P-40 was a good aircraft, but was already obsolete by 1943. The P-40 had been superseded by more modern aircraft. The P-40 had inferior performance compared to German fighters. The military gave the 99th the worst equipment available as a deliberate test of their capability. But this obstacle also had an unexpected effect. Pilots who could fly P-40s successfully in combat against German fighters were exceptional pilots. Pilots who achieved kills while flying inferior aircraft were exceptionally skilled. Pilots who overcame equipment disadvantages were exceptionally determined. The equipment disadvantage became proof of exceptional capability. The third obstacle was prejudice. Military leadership doubted that black pilots could fly combat aircraft. Military media coverage was hostile. Military bureaucracy created obstacles. Military policy tried to prevent the program from succeeding. Military culture was resistant to integration. But this obstacle also had an unexpected effect. Pilots who persisted in the face of cultural prejudice were exceptionally resilient. Pilots who excelled despite doubts about their capabilities were exceptionally confident. Pilots who succeeded against institutional resistance were exceptionally committed. The prejudice became a filter that selected only the most exceptional pilots. By the time the 382nd was fully operational with P-51 Mustangs, the military had created the most exceptional fighter pilots in existence. The military had designed obstacles intended to prove that black pilots were inferior. The military had instead created proof that black pilots were exceptional. Subscribe, because understanding how obstacles can produce exceptional results is essential for every leader seeking to build high-performing organizations. Now let me tell you about Eleanor Roosevelt's role, because understanding Roosevelt's involvement helps explain how the Tuskegee program got approved despite military prejudice. Eleanor Roosevelt visited Tuskegee Institute in 1941. Roosevelt was interested in the Tuskegee program. Roosevelt understood the civil rights implications. Roosevelt was sympathetic to efforts to break down racial barriers. Roosevelt decided to take a flight with Charles Chief Anderson. Anderson was one of the first black pilots trained at Tuskegee. The symbolic importance of this flight cannot be overstated. Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the president, flying with a black pilot, sent a message. The message was that black pilots were capable. The message was that the First Lady had confidence in black pilots. The message was that aviation by black pilots was not just acceptable, but worthy of the attention of the nation's leadership. This flight had consequences. The Roosevelt flight made it politically difficult for the military to shut down the Tuskegee program. The Roosevelt flight made it politically costly to sabotage the program. The Roosevelt flight made the Tuskegee program a matter of national prestige. The Roosevelt flight helped ensure that the program would continue despite military resistance. This is a lesson about political support for innovation. When leaders like Eleanor Roosevelt support programs that challenge existing policies, those programs gain political protection. When leaders are willing to publicly support challenging initiatives, it becomes more difficult for institutions to sabotage them. Political support transforms a program that could be killed from within into a program that has institutional protection. Like this video, because understanding how political support enables institutional change is essential for every leader seeking to implement controversial reforms. Now let me explain the specific combat effectiveness of the 392nd's close escort doctrine, because understanding the tactical details helps explain why the doctrine was revolutionary. Standard fighter escort doctrine involved what was called freelance escorting. Fighters flew ahead of and above bombers. Fighters patrolled aggressively. When enemy fighters appeared, fighters would engage them far from the bombers. This approach had the advantage of potentially destroying enemy fighters before they could reach bombers. But this approach had a critical disadvantage. It left bombers undefended. The 332nd rejected freelance escorting. The 332nd adopted what was called close escort. Close escort meant staying with the bombers constantly. Close escort meant flying protective formations around bombers. Close escort meant accepting that some enemy fighters would reach the bombers but ensuring that other fighters would be there to defend them. Close escort meant prioritizing bomber protection over achieving kills. The tactical impact was measurable. When fighters left bombers to pursue enemy fighters reached the bombers. Bombers suffered casualties. When fighters stayed with bombers, enemy fighters could not attack without confronting the escort fighters. Bombers suffered fewer casualties. But there was another effect. Bomber crews knew they were protected. Bomber crews could focus on their bombing mission. Bomber crews had confidence that if they were attacked, the red tails would be there. This psychological effect was nearly as important as the physical protection. Bomber crews were no longer afraid. The 332nd's close escort doctrine was so effective that other fighter groups eventually adopted it. The 332nd's innovation became standard practice. The close escort doctrine that the 332nd pioneered is still used in military aviation today. This teaches an organizational lesson. Sometimes the right approach is not the aggressive approach. Sometimes the right approach is to focus on protecting the core mission instead of pursuing secondary objectives. Sometimes organizations can create competitive advantages by focusing all efforts on what matters most, rather than pursuing individual achievements. Like this video, because understanding how to align organizational efforts toward core mission is essential for every organization seeking maximum effectiveness. Now let me tell you about specific 332nd pilots and their achievements, because understanding individual stories helps explain why the 332nd was so remarkable. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was the commander. Davis was a West Point graduate. Davis was a pilot trained at Tuskegee. Davis became one of the most respected military leaders of his generation. Davis commanded the 332nd with exceptional skill. Davis established the culture of excellence that made the 332nd legendary. Charles Chief Anderson was one of the first Tuskegee graduates. Anderson flew the historic flight with Eleanor Roosevelt. Anderson was an exceptional pilot. Anderson became a check pilot, training other Tuskegee pilots. Anderson was instrumental in establishing the high standards that made Tuskegee pilots exceptional. Charles Hall shot down the first enemy aircraft by a black American pilot. Hall's kill on June 9, 1943 broke a barrier. Hall's achievement proved that black pilots could achieve combat success. Hall's victory inspired other Tuskegee pilots. There were many other exceptional pilots. Medals were earned, records were set, innovations were created. The 332nd produced dozens of exceptional pilots. The 332nd produced a fighter group that was among the best in the entire theater. The 332nd produced a legacy that continues today. These individual pilots had something in common. They understood that they were representing more than themselves. They understood that their performance was political. They understood that their success would influence military policy. They understood that failure would be interpreted as proof of inferiority. They carried that burden. They performed with excellence. This is the power of purpose. When individuals understand that their performance has significance beyond themselves, when individuals understand that their work influences larger issues, when individuals carry purpose as well as performing tasks, individuals achieve exceptional results. Subscribe, because understanding the power of purpose in driving exceptional performance is essential for every leader seeking to motivate teams. Tell me in the comments about times you've seen purpose drive exceptional performance. Tell me about situations where individuals achieved more because they understood that their work had significance beyond themselves. Share your stories because they matter. Now let me explain how the 332nd success influenced military desegregation, because understanding this impact explains why the 332nd matters beyond military aviation. By 1945, it was impossible for the military to argue that black Americans were not capable of flying combat aircraft. The 332nd had provided irrefutable evidence. The 332nd had shot down enemy aircraft. The 332nd had protected bombers. The 332nd had performed at the highest levels. The 332nd had become legendary, but the military was still segregated. Military leadership still resisted integration. Military policy still enforced segregation. The military had evidence that segregation was counterproductive. The military had evidence that black pilots were as capable as white pilots, but the military was not ready to change policy. It took external political pressure. It took President Truman's commitment to civil rights. It took Executive Order 9981 in 1948. It took the Cold War context where American segregation was becoming a diplomatic liability. It took all of these factors to force military integration. But the 382nd had done something crucial. The 332nd had made military segregation indefensible. The 332nd had provided evidence that segregation was unjust and inefficient. The 332nd had made integration inevitable. The 332nd had changed what was possible. This is the long-term power of excellence in evidence. When individuals or organizations provide irrefutable evidence that existing policies are wrong, they change what becomes possible. When individuals break barriers, they make integration inevitable. When excellence is combined with justice, change becomes possible. Like this video because understanding how evidence changes institutional policy is essential for every person seeking to challenge unjust systems. The 332nd's legacy continues today. Modern Air Force doctrine incorporates close escort principles that the 332nd pioneered. Modern military policy prohibits segregation because the 332nd made integration inevitable. Modern military aviation includes black pilots as a matter of course, rather than as an exception. The 332nd's achievement was profound and lasting, but perhaps the most important legacy is cultural. The 332nd demonstrated that segregation was unjust. The 332nd demonstrated that merit transcends race. The 332nd demonstrated that military excellence cannot be separated from fairness. The 332nd demonstrated that the best organizations are integrated organizations. Every organization today benefits from the 330 seconds achievement. Every organization that values merit over race benefits from the 330 seconds precedent. Every integrated organization stands on the foundation that the 330 second helped establish. The 330 seconds achievement was not just military. The 330 seconds achievement was cultural and social. Comment below with your commitment to building organizations based on merit rather than discrimination. Tell me that you will evaluate people based on capability rather than background. Share your commitment because this principle that the 330 second helped establish needs to be reinforced in every generation. This is the complete story of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Red Tails. The story of the 332nd Fighter Group. The story of how men facing systematic discrimination created doctrinal innovations that changed military aviation forever. The 303 seconds bomber escort record was unprecedented. The 303 seconds close escort doctrine was revolutionary. The 303 seconds impact on military desegregation was profound. The 303 seconds legacy continues to influence military aviation and military policy today. The 303 seconds achievement demonstrates that military excellence transcends race. The 303 seconds legacy reminds every organization that merit matters more than discrimination. Thank you for learning this story. Thank you for understanding why the Tuskegee Airmen and Red Tails matter. Thank you for recognizing that outstanding performance is the most powerful response to discrimination. Now go share this story everywhere. Let me give you the absolute final section of this story. This section brings everything together. This section answers the question of what the Tuskegee Airmen story means for you and your organization today. The Tuskegee Airmen and Red Tails story is not just history. The story is not just about World War II. The story is not just about military aviation. The story is about fundamental organizational principles. The story is about how to build organizations that excel. The story is about how to build organizations that matter. The story is about how to build organizations that change the world. The principles are simple. First, commit to excellence. Commit to being the best. Commit to setting high standards. Commit to refusing mediocrity. Commit to excellence in everything you do. The 332nd committed to excellence. The 332nd became legendary. Second, create fairness. Create equal opportunity. Create cultures where people are valued based on merit. Create organizations where race doesn't matter. Create organizations where background doesn't matter. Create organizations where capability is the only consideration. The 332nd created fairness. The 332nd became legendary. Third, build cohesion. Build teams that trust each other. Build organizations where people support each other. Build organizations where people understand they are working toward shared goals. Build organizations where unity is intentional. The 332nd built cohesion. The 332nd became legendary. Fourth, maintain focus. Focus on your primary mission. Don't get distracted by secondary objectives. Don't abandon your core purpose. Don't lose sight of what matters. Focus completely on what your organization is designed to do. The 332nd maintained focus. The 332nd became legendary. Fifth, innovate. Don't accept standard approaches. Don't accept established doctrine. Don't accept, that's the way we've always done it. Question approaches. Develop better methods. Pioneer new solutions. The 332nd innovated. The 332nd became legendary. Sixth, confront injustice. Don't tolerate discrimination. Don't accept racism. Don't allow unfairness. Confront injustice directly. Create cultures where injustice is not tolerated. The 332nd confronted injustice. The 332nd became legendary. These 6 principles are the foundation of the Tuskegee Airmen story. These principles created a legendary organization. These principles can create legendary organizations in your industry. These principles can transform your organization. These principles can make your organization matter. The question is whether you will commit to these principles. The question is whether you will build an organization based on these principles. The question is whether your organization will become legendary. I am asking you to make a commitment to excellence, a commitment to fairness, a commitment to cohesion, a commitment to focus, a commitment to innovation, a commitment to confronting injustice, a commitment to building organizations that matter. Make this commitment right now. Write it down. Tell your team. Hold yourself accountable. This commitment will transform your organization. This commitment will make your organization legendary. Tell me in the comments that you make these commitments. Tell me that your organization will commit to excellence. Tell me that your organization will commit to fairness. Tell me that your organization will build cohesion. Tell me that your organization will maintain focus. Tell me that your organization will innovate. Tell me that your organization will confront injustice. Share your commitment publicly. Hold yourself accountable. Make sure that your organization follows through on these commitments. Like this video. Share this story. Comment with your commitment. Tag others who need to hear this message. Make sure that this story reaches millions of people. Make sure that the legacy of the Red Tails influences organizations everywhere. This is the complete story. This is the complete lesson. This is the complete message. The Tuskegee Airmen changed military aviation. The Red Tails changed military policy. The 392nd changed American society. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that excellence transcends race. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that merit matters. The Tuskegee Airmen proved that organizations built on fairness and excellence create legends. Your organization can do the same. Your organization can change your industry. Your organization can create excellence. Your organization can create fairness. Your organization can create a legend. Your organization can matter. The choice is yours. The time is now. The Red Tails are waiting for you to join them. The 302nd is waiting for you to become part of something legendary. The Tuskegee Airmen are waiting for you to answer their call. Will you answer? Will you commit to these principles? Will you build an organization that matters? Will you create a legacy that endures? Will you become part of the Red Tail legacy? The answer is in your hands. The time is now. Go build your legendary organization. Go create excellence. Go create fairness. Go create cohesion. Go innovate. Go confront injustice. Go make a difference. The Red Tails await. The moment is now. The opportunity is in front of you. What will you do? This is the complete story of the Tuskegee Airmen and the Red Tails of the 332nd Fighter Group. This is the story that every organization should learn. This is the story that should influence how every organization is built. This is the story that proves organizations built on excellence, fairness, and cohesion create legends. Now go tell this story to others. Go share the message. Go inspire your organization. Go build something legendary. Thank you for listening to the complete story. Thank you for understanding why it matters. Thank you for committing to these principles. Thank you for being willing to build organizations that matter. The Red Tails are legendary. Will your organization be legendary? The choice is yours. The time is now. Go do it. The Tuskegee Airmen story continues, not in history books, not in archives, but in organizations that commit to these principles. The Tuskegee Airmen story continues in organizations that build excellence. The Tuskegee Airmen story continues in organizations that create fairness. The Tuskegee Airmen story continues in organizations that matter. Your organization can be part of this continuing story. Your organization can embody these principles. Your organization can create a legend. Your organization can matter. This is the final message. This is the final call. This is the final opportunity. Will you answer? The Red Tails await. The 332nd awaits. The Tuskegee Airmen await. They are waiting for you to join them. They are waiting for you to build organizations that embody their principles. They are waiting for you to create legends. They are waiting for you to matter. Now go do it.